I think we might get started. We've got a lot of people online, which is great. Everyone's punctual. Thank you for that. My name's Shari Burke. I'm the Partnerships and Events Manager here at Australian Organic. Welcome to this seminar on Singapore. It's going to be the first of a series including Hong Kong, the UAE, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea and Vietnam. It's a collaborative webinar this morning. First of all, we have Catherine from Asialink and then Najib from Export Connect. Q&As are down the bottom. If you have any questions, please pop them in as you think about them. At the moment, we've got Catherine scheduled to go until just after 12, that's Brisbane time, and then we've got 15 minutes for Q&A. Then we'll have a 5-minute break and then on to Najib. Sorry, I forgot to mention Owen as well. He'll be on later this afternoon as well. Catherine, over to you. Enjoy, everybody, and I'll see you again after Catherine's presentation.
Thanks very much, Shari. Good morning and welcome, everybody. It's great to see you and great to be part of this first series. I'd like to start this morning, if I could, with an acknowledgement to country. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're present today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending the session online today. Just a little bit about me and I guess us as part of Asialink Group. Some of you will know that Asialink Group has been set up here in Australia for 30 years, and the mandate is very much around building that capability for Australia to engage more deeply with Asia. And the part of the business that I sit within is our Asialink Business Group. And we have the mission from the Commonwealth Government to really focus as Australia's National Centre for Asia Capability on building the kind of workforce capability that helps organisations like yours to navigate Asia and Asia opportunities more successfully. So really delighted to have this time. We've got about 60 minutes to do 3 things together this morning. So let's just take a look at those. Really would like to give you an overview of Singapore in the sense of where has Singapore as a market come from? What does that mean when you think about doing business and operating there? We'd like to introduce just a few frameworks that will help you in terms of navigating culture generally. And then we'd really like to deep dive into the Singaporean mindset in terms of how does that play out in Singapore. Before we do that, I'd love to get a sense in the group of the experience that you've had so far in terms of working in Singapore, traveling to Singapore, perhaps living in Singapore, or perhaps none of those things. So we're just going to run a short poll. And if you could just take a minute just to let me know the kind of experience you've had with Singapore so we can adapt the content to you a little bit. So if you've lived and worked in Singapore or perhaps studied, perhaps you've worked with Singapore partners or you've holidayed in Singapore or you've had no contact. Choose any that apply to you. You can just jump in and select. And then I think behind the scenes, we'll have that poll pulling up for us. A few more responses coming in. Wonderful. And do we have that poll result? Okay. So more than half of you have been to Singapore at some point in time. That's fantastic. About a fifth of you are already working with Singaporean partners. A couple of you have lived and worked in Singapore and others have studied. And some of you don't have experience yet. So look, a real range. I'd love to draw on your experiences as we go through the morning. Look, I appreciate we've got 60 minutes for this session, so it's not a long time, but I will invite you to use the Q&A and the chat box. So when I invite you to, you know, share a few thoughts, that would be really helpful in terms of just making sure that we're on point. Just maybe a little bit about me. I lived and worked in Singapore for the last sort of 20 years. And of that time, I've spent 2 chunks of time based in Singapore. So from 2006 to 2009, living and working there. And again, from 2011 to 2015, and for the last 5 years, have been working between Singapore and Melbourne with, you know, a week at a time in Singapore and a month back. And so what I'd like to do today is share some of those personal experiences, which we hope would be helpful as you think about the opportunities for you, as you think about Singapore as a market, as well as sharing some of the frameworks that are more commonly used across the market. So let's take a look at Singapore. And we just wanted to share this video with you. I'd love to just hear some of the words that come to mind as you listen to this story.
They said we have nothing. No land. No hope.
Every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish.
They said we couldn't survive. They said we have no labor, no skill, no infrastructure. Create the world's best airline? They said no way. Change the face of transport across Asia? They said don't even try. Turn the city into a nighttime racetrack? Engineer a plaster that heals artery walls?
It's impossible.
$1 billion brand for gamers? Lead the world in martial arts? They said it was impossible.
I'd love to get a few reactions in the chat. So if you can use the chat box, as you listen to that video clip, what stands out for you? Yeah, thanks, Angeline, so inspiring. Others of you, as you listen to that video clip and watch that footage, some of the words that come up and stand out for you? Inspiring, dynamic, loving the video. It's highly emotional, isn't it? And I feel that every time I watch the video. And look, some of you will know the Singapore story really well. But for those of you who don't, it's worth recapping, in fact, that, you know, compared to countries like China and India, Singapore's one of the less old countries in the Asia region. But had been operating really as a trading port since sort of 1298 AD. And then really in 1819, we saw Stamford Raffles land in Singapore, kind of go, wow, this is a great geographic location. What a great trading post, and claimed it for the British Empire. And then we saw Singapore really as a British colony right through until World War II. And some of you will know that in World War II, in fact, Singapore was occupied by the Japanese. And at the end of World War II, there was a struggle as Singapore started to think about, it had gone back to British colonial rule, what do we want to be? And this real sense of wanting to, you know, an anti-colonial sentiment, certainly, and this desire to be self-governing. And in 1959, Singapore became self-governing. Because Singapore is so small and without resources, Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister, felt that it would be safer and stronger to be part of Malaysia. And so in 1963, the agreement was made that Singapore and Malaysia would be one, but it lasted just 2 years. And when you look at that video clip, that's 1965. with Lee Kuan Yew saying, you know, we're severing time. And the important piece around what we see from 1965 through to today is this real striving of Singapore, this tiny piece of land, you know, 700 square k's, sort of 42 k's by 23 k's, just a tiny piece of land, no natural resources, and this real striving to become this modern, ambitious, successful Singapore. And if we look at the data, it tells us some amazing things have happened in the last 50 years. So in that 50 years, we've seen Singapore shoot up as one of the top destinations for business. It takes 15 minutes to set your business up in Singapore. The sense of really needing to be hungry around this continuous need to drive change, to innovate, to keep moving, or to lose out. So you see huge investments in innovation. You've seen over the last 10 years a lot of focus in investing in innovation ecosystems and infrastructure for bringing science and technological experimentation into Singapore, setting Singapore as a hub for all of these things. And if you look at Singapore now, you can see some of the additional elements. We'll just take a quick look at some of those. A real focus on ensuring that the company opens up through policy, through economic regulation, through building up the workforce. There's a focus on education, tax systems, really making it easy to do business here. The other thing that you'll notice in terms of the Singapore ecosystem itself is that Singapore has a really clear strategy. It says we would like to be a hub for business. If you think about where organisations are encouraged through primarily tax provisions, but also access to talent to set up their headquarters, Singapore is the leading hub in the region for regional headquarters for organisations. And we also see strong investment in manufacturing. So we've got this real sort of global hub for business. Singapore itself, in the last 5 years particularly, has really been focused in terms of becoming this sort of smart nation, strong investment in technology and technological infrastructure. And we've got a few examples of that on the next pages. Lots of the things that you'll see, so in terms of tech-enabled, the government itself has made strong investments in terms of ensuring that digital infrastructure is up and running, ensuring that there is the access to well-qualified talent that are able to really run this fast-paced digital economy, and that the government is doing as much as it can to ensure that Singapore's really transformed through technological transformation. Over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, we've seen every industry in Singapore put about its industry transformation map. So there are 23 industry transformation maps, which are all focused on how does Singapore continue to evolve, how do we leverage digital technology, how do we ensure that we're innovating constantly in order to be ahead of the curve. Having said all of that, Singapore also has not been immune to COVID and has experienced its worst ever economic contraction, and we've seen that. We've seen, though, that there's been a huge amount of government investment in terms of helping Singapore come out stronger from COVID than we've seen other countries. And just yesterday, we saw Singapore announce that it's really focused on some specific policies and actions that will help open Singapore up even more quickly than it has. And so that's really through contact tracing, and that's through real strong push of vaccination and thinking about what vaccination passports would look like in order to open the borders up, because there's this really strong drive to continue to be economically successful and to ensure that everything that can be done to ensure that business as usual continues is done. So against that backdrop, we also probably wanted to share A little later, you're going to get more info on what it looks like in terms of your businesses and the opportunities there. But we're definitely seeing Singapore's attracted to new products, the opportunity to really be seen, to tap into what's emerging. So there's a huge interest in the organic market. It's grown by a third in the past 5 years. And there's a willingness to invest in terms of organically grown products and produce, with over half of consumers in Singapore saying that they would be willing to spend a quarter more for something that is organic. And obviously the Australia brand is huge in terms of what Australia stands for in Singapore. So the things that you would expect in terms of we're seen as clean and green and safe. We're seen as premium and authentic, and those are things that are important in terms of the Singapore psyche. So given that there's so much potential, one of the things that we thought it might be helpful is also to just introduce a few frameworks when you think about whether Singapore is a market for you, what it takes in order to be successful moving forward. So we just wanted to spend a minute to introduce a couple of frameworks that might help you think about what it's like to do business in Singapore. And many of you will be familiar with the iceberg, you know, the sense of what we see above the surface is 10% really of everything that's going on. And then there's a huge amount that's going on beneath the surface. I would love if you were happy to use the chat just to call out for those of you who've spent time in Singapore, you've lived there, you've studied there, or perhaps you've visited. What are some of the things that you notice when you first land in Singapore, or that you've noticed as you spend time? So those things that you see or hear or smell. A little bit of a use of the chat for some of those things would be wonderful. Yeah, some of the things that you've noticed. Doesn't have to be big, it might be the small things. Yeah, convenience is key, and you see that in terms of the way food stalls are set up, the way public transport operates and runs. Yeah, fantastic. Other things that people have noticed? Yep, very organised and structured. And you'll see that from, again, transportation through the way business meetings are run. Yeah, thanks, Michael, that you're noticing it's very polite, and we're noticing the clean and the green, noticing the focus on food. Yeah, some great insights in terms of what you might see. And typically, what we see when we first start working somewhere or living somewhere or visiting are those surface things, the things that we can see, the things that we can hear. So it's the sounds, it's the language, it's the food, it's the noise, it's the architecture. We notice that Singapore is incredibly modern in terms of the buildings, but juxtapositioned next to sort of old shop houses. The things that are much more impactful when you think about what it will be like to do business in Singapore is that deeper piece that sits beneath the surface. And so here we're thinking about what are some of the values, the assumptions, some of the beliefs that drive how Singaporeans think and behave, and how that influences what's important to them when they're thinking about partnering with you, when they're thinking about perhaps buying or consuming your product, when they're thinking about how your products and services might actually compare with others. And so a little bit of what we wanted to spend some time looking at today is what are some of those values and assumptions? How are they similar or different to the way we might typically see things here in Australia? And how might that help you shape the way you approach the market? When we think about, so many of you, you know, over half of you have spent time in Singapore and I guess traveling in other markets and working there too. when we think about that chance to sort of work outside Australia and be successful outside Australia, we know that cultural intelligence becomes important. So I kind of smile and go, you know, IQ is about how well we know a market. So it's our ability to kind of have knowledge, which, you know, understand intellectually how something works. And EQ we heard more of in the last sort of 15 years, and that's the ability to be resilient, the interpersonal skill sets that we need to succeed in business. CQ is really that ability to function in cultures which are different from our own and often quite diverse and distinct. And when we think about this, it's really about being able to do three things. So to have a strong sense of cultural intelligence, number one is definitely the knowledge of the culture. So the sorts of things that you've just shared. So looking at what do we see and notice, you know, how do people behave, what do they wear and how do they eat? But what's sitting beneath of that is the mindfulness. So the second piece that we want to get good at is really observing and interpreting. What does that mean in this situation for these folks? And the third thing is really this ability that we might have to work across cultures. One observation I just wanted to share with you is I've been living and working across Asia, including Vietnam, Hong Kong, Singapore as places that I've lived, but working extensively in China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia. And typically in my work, and I work with all sorts of multinationals, I don't necessarily just work with Australian organisations, but one of the most common requests that I get typically runs like this. I've got an Australian executive who's in my team, they're amazing at their job, but they're not able to get things done. Can you coach them? And I share this with you because the can you coach them or can you work with them is often around this third bubble, this ability or this willingness to really adapt our behaviour into what's appropriate and new in different situations. And I'm not saying that that's true for everybody. It's just that it happens to be a quite common challenge. And one of the things that we hope might be helpful for you as we run through the rest of this session is just to get a bit more insight into what some of those big differences are. And if we think then about our willingness and our ability to adapt, what we might look for and how that might help us perhaps position or see a situation differently. Let's just jump straight into looking at the Singapore context. And yeah, Kat, I might just move on to the Singapore mindset. So if we go back to that beginning of time story, in terms of how Singapore has been settled, Singapore has been a melting pot in terms of, it started off as a trading hub. You've got a whole different groups of people who arrived in Singapore at different times. So you've got Chinese who arrived from Chinese mainland. You can see Singapore's proximity to Malaysia. We had, you know, a number of folks come into Singapore from Malaysia. And over time there were folks who also came in from India through their own course or also as indentured workers. So there's real melting pot of ethnic groups in Singapore. So you Chinese, Malay, Indian, and Eurasian. The largest group is Chinese, and about 70% of the ethnic group in Singapore is Chinese, followed by Malay, Indian, and Eurasian. What that also means in that melting pot of cultures is you also have a melting pot of languages, and there are 4 languages that you will hear spoken across Singapore. One of the decisions that Lee Kuan Yew took way back in 1965 was to keep English, which had been the language of the British administration, as the core and common language across Singapore. So that was with a real strong economic perspective, which is if we can keep English as our language of administration and business, it's also going to help us as we start to reinvent ourselves into what we hope will be this economic powerhouse moving forward. However, people's mother tongues, in terms of what they have at home, are different. So English is used for administration, for government, in school. It's the primary language of education. Every child who goes to school in Singapore is also required to have a second language, a mother tongue. So that's taught in school. The other advantage, and it's worth knowing in terms of the languages that you'll hear, is that you'll hear Mandarin in Singapore. Most of you will probably know that Mandarin is the second Chinese language for most folks of Chinese origin or Chinese ethnicity in Singapore, because China's huge and diverse. So folks' first language might be Cantonese or Hokkien, and Mandarin is the overlay. Those sorts of things are important to know, just in the sense of, although Singapore is so tiny, it's incredibly diverse. So you've got a huge sort of cultural diversity, you've got linguistic diversity, but there's been a lot of effort to unify Singapore through the use of English and through the melting and melding of languages together. When we look at a little bit of info now, which might act as a map which helps you navigate and think about what's important, given the dominance of the Chinese ethnic group in Singapore, so remember that's 70% of folks are from Chinese ethnicity, a lot of what you hear and read about Singapore does derive from that Chinese ethnic background. However, remember, when you're working in Singapore, you're going to have, folks who are Malay ethnicity, Indian, Eurasian, and, a huge expat community as well. So folks coming from other parts of the region into Singapore. So I just give that as a bit of a proviso in the sense of what we look at is, a simplification of what you might see, but Singapore itself is very diverse. One of the things that we often start with, and you're thinking about, okay, I'm wondering whether Singapore is a market for me and my business. It's helpful to think about the starting point for different cultures or countries. And one of the starting points that is quite different and distinct is whether that country is most focused on getting the relationship right first, or most focused on getting the task done first. And I'd love some guesses. If we were thinking about this on a spectrum of all the countries around the world, which countries might you put at the top end of that scale in terms of countries which are really focused on building the relationship as a key to getting a good result, prioritizing, maintaining relationships over accomplishing tasks and focusing on really getting to know people? Would you be happy to use the chat? What are some of the countries that you think might be up there on that right hand top corner? Any guesses for those of you who've been spending? Yep, I've got Japan. Any other guesses or thoughts? Australia. Okay, nice. Any other guesses or thoughts? Malaysia. Yeah. South Korea. Great. Let's see what the computer says. Absolutely. Japan, China, India, all up there in terms of really high relationship focus. Thanks, Peter. Australia is much more to the deal-focused end. So while relationships are important to us, we really typically as a culture place a lot of emphasis on reaching our goals and objectives, really ensuring that the task gets done and the work gets delivered. And so probably more at the other end of the spectrum. Thoughts on where Singapore might sit on this line? Closer to Japan, closer to Australia? Happy to take some responses in the chat box. Yeah, where would Singapore sit, do you think? Yeah, Anchor, more relationship focused? Yeah. Yeah, Liz? Yep, so sense that they'd be more relationship focused. And you're right. Let's take a look at where they pop up. So we see Singapore pretty much in the middle of that bunch of countries. And there's a few reasons for that. We'll take a look at some of the aspects which talk to relationship. So whilst Singapore is a country where relationships are important, when we look at the context, particularly of the last 50 years, that strong focus on needing to achieve, needing to get things done in order to survive really has influenced the way you see things done in Singapore. So look, I want to just give us a quick mental map. One of the things we often say when we're thinking about culture is a little map that helps us navigate how to think about cultures is a nice and useful tool to have in the back pocket. One of the tools that has been pulled together is a tool called Globe Smart. And the reason we use it at Asialink is it's an amalgamation of the thinking of the best leaders in cross-cultural research. And so I share that because what this tool has done is it's merged all of the work that's been done by leaders like Hofstadter, Schwartz, McRae and Engelhardt, and taken all of that data and said, look, if we look at that, we notice that there are 5 critical cultural dimensions. And I wanted to run through them, but a few provisos. We're a group of 30 or so folks from around Australia joining this webinar this morning. We're not the same. Each of us are individuals. Each of us come from our own families, our own parts of the country. We have our own interests, and those things shape the way we see the world. And culture really is the way we see the world. So, kind of lesson or rule or warning number 1, not everybody in a culture will be exactly the same. We know that. But we can look at some broad things that typically run across cultures, where we see countries and folks within those countries tend to be more similar around dimensions. And the first one that we just want to run through is this thing called an individual's obligation to the group. And so it's kind of, how do I see myself? On the right-hand side, do I see myself as being more interdependent? Do I feel that I'm more connected and collective and I focus on the group most? Or on the left-hand side, do I feel that I'm more independent? I think about myself and then I think about the group. And I'd ask you, perhaps if you've got a piece of paper in front of you, to just do a quick map for you personally. If you were to map yourself on a continuum where independent on the left-hand side is really around greatest importance is on individual identity. I prefer to take actions on my own. Or on the right-hand side, where I'm more interdependent, a lot of importance on the harmony of the group, being a collective. Where might you plot yourself? And could I get a thought from some of you? Where might you plot Australians generally, are we more to the left, more independent, or more to the right, interdependent? Feel free to use the chat. Independent, yep, to the left. Yeah, absolutely spot on. So in Australian culture, we value being independent. We value the fact that we take action independently. We value the fact that personal choice and personal achievement is something that's important to us. Not surprisingly, if we look at Singapore, Singapore has a strong preference for more interdependence. And a really simple example that I often share, when you're in Singapore and you're exchanging business cards, the surname when I'm in Singapore on my business card is first. My surname Lee and my first name Catherine. So if you look at a business card, the first name that you see is the family name, because being part of that collective, part of that group is most important. In Australia, obviously, it's the opposite. Our first name is important. I'm Catherine, and then I'm part of the Lee family. The second factor that we think of in terms of those cultural dimensions, Kat, I might just jump back for a minute if that's okay. Yeah. There's something that we kind of talk about, which is what's my relationship to hierarchy? And on the left-hand side, we're really talking about being really comfortable with everybody being equal. Everybody's equal, so whether I'm junior or senior, I've got the right to share my point of view, and I'm expected to share my point of view. On the right-hand side, actually, it's our value is more status and hierarchically determined. So actually, folks who are more senior or more experienced have the right to decide and to contribute. So where this is a strong preference, we're not encouraged to speak out. You know, we are encouraged to be differential to folks who are more senior than us. And we are encouraged to adapt our behaviour depending on who else is in the room. And as we just talked about, you know, in Australia, we're much more likely to be on the left. Again, in Singapore, more likely to be on the right. That third dimension is just how comfortable do we feel with things that we don't know, uncertainty, unknown elements. On the left-hand side of this, you know, there's a high level of comfort with risk, uncertainty, not knowing. So typically what we see in cultures that are comfortable here is a lot of rapid and quick decision making. We see a real focus on being flexible and innovative, changing in the moment. And the value is on going fast versus being thorough. On the right-hand side, what we see is much more comfort with having known and proven processes, really having established proper procedures, and being thorough is much more important than being fast. Not surprisingly, Australia again has a preference to be on the left-hand side of this dimension, and in Singapore, a stronger preference to be on the right-hand side. And so, typically, what you might see here is in Australia, we really value that out-of-the-box thinking. We value speed, we value ideas in the moment, and we value changing things in the moment. In a Singapore context, that's not highly valued. If we're underprepared, if we're thinking outside of what's already been agreed, that's viewed with a bit of suspicion, and it's not valued in the same way that we would value. The fourth dimension that's important to think about is how direct communications are. So on the left-hand side, we have cultures that really value being super direct. And that means we come to the point quickly, we're pretty forthright, we're happy to share our point of view. On the right-hand side, we've got cultures which are much less direct. And an indirect way of communicating means I'm going to give as much context as I can. I'm going to speak around a question or challenge rather than share it with you directly. I'm not going to feel comfortable or that it's appropriate to give feedback which is negative. I'm not going to ask questions in a public place because you might not know the answer, but it also might show my lack of knowledge. And I'm not going to disagree in ways that are obvious. I'm going to do that much more subtly. Not surprisingly, in Australia, we do have a strong preference to be direct. We're really comfortable with disagreeing. We're comfortable with pointing out what's wrong. In Singapore, it's not as extreme as some of the other examples, but it's certainly a much more indirect way of communicating. And so the things that we watch out for in a Singapore context are certainly the pieces around, you know, how do you raise questions for feedback? It's much more valuable to do that in a one-to-one setting rather than a group. It's really important to listen to what's not being said. So a yes doesn't mean yes, I agree. It means yes, I've heard you. And so finding ways to communicate, particularly getting feedback, asking for feedback, giving feedback is really important. And the final dimension that's worth really focusing on is just this basis for trust. And cultures that are on the left-hand side of this dimension, the way we build trust is through getting work done. So our belief is, if I do a good job, that will build trust, and then you will like me. For cultures that have a focus on relationships, the belief is, if I build the relationship with you, and we know and like each other, that helps me get the task done. So the starting points are quite different. One thing that it's helpful and useful to think about is that actually all of these things come together and they interplay. And that's really what's causing some of the complexity when you're thinking about doing business in Singapore. And so an example I would share is where we have really strong preferences, which are highly valued in Australia, they might be seen quite differently in Singapore. I was part of a board that was looking to recruit a non-executive director into the board. And as the chairman was running through the slate of candidates who were going to be part of the possible pool of candidates to be selected from, he went through the profile of an Australian woman, and she had a great pedigree. She'd been working across a huge number of multinationals. She had strong technology expertise, which was a core capability that they were looking for, and had strong networks within the market, which was also something that was important to them in terms of what they needed onto the board at that particular point in time. However, the chairman asked this question. He asked about the communication style of this individual. And the only word that was shared back was that she was outspoken. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that the chairman discounted this person as a potential director on the board. And I'd love to hear a couple words in the chat about what it is about being outspoken in a Singaporean context, which would mean that somebody is discounted and discarded for a role on a board, given the sorts of things that we've talked about just now. So some thoughts in the chat around why being outspoken might not be useful in a Singapore context. seen as being rude, absolutely. And the being rude in this context is definitely about the status. So the chairman of the board is the most senior person on that board. And the expectation is on the Singaporean board, as the most senior, yeah, thanks Cherie, may not fit into that hierarchical chain. So whilst we would say being outspoken gives you the chance to, yeah, absolutely, relationship to hierarchy. And so in this board, we're not expected to be outspoken. We're absolutely expected to listen, share points of view in ways that will be helpful, but certainly not in an open forum, and certainly not to provide a challenging or alternate point of view to the chairman's point of view in a public forum. And so one of the things that I wanted to link this back to is in Australia, where we really value being outspoken and we really value being direct and we really value being equal, lots of the things that we think are important in terms of building a relationship actually are not important. And in fact will become negatives or barriers to you being successful in that context. So just a few tips that we wanted to share in the sense of how do you overcome some of those things. And one of the ways that you want to think about how can you be effective when you're communicating, how can you be effective when you're thinking about partners, is what happens in the context of the meetings that you're setting up. And so given that a meeting in Singapore has many constraints to it, we also have to think about what are some of the things that we can do before, during and after some of those communication sessions to really understand what's going on and to really think about the messages that you can give there and the way that you can get feedback on how people are responding to what you're sharing. So sort of a bit of a rule of thumb, we would suggest that you really spend 50% of time preparing for meetings that you want to have or any kind of connection that you're going to have. And the preparation is things that we might not intuitively do in an Australian context and things that we might not intuitively do in a smaller enterprise either. So structure, being well prepared, agendas are all important in terms of that dimension around certainty. So really laying out very clearly the things that would be covered, giving people a sense of how that would be covered so that people can come into your session prepared as well. The other thing that's really important, given that status and knowing where people fit in and who's important and who's going to be taking decisions, is just being really clear who you are, your role, and ensuring that you understand that with others too. So when you set up for a meeting, having the opportunity to share job titles, to share a little bit about the responsibilities that you have and the decisions that you take are all part of sort of lying out that communication so that it becomes much more effective and much more impactful. The other thing to think about is what happens in the meeting will be relatively predetermined. There's not going to be a lot of movement in the meeting. So finding avenues which are a little bit more informal are also going to be important. So finding those one-to-one connections post to check in and really understand what else you might need to have asked, which didn't come up, will be important in terms of getting some good and useful feedback. I wonder whether it might also be useful just to think about some of the other elements of business etiquette that you might come across. For those of you who are, which most of us are now, spending time virtually communicating with Singapore, lots of things that we do in an Australia context will still be useful. But it's also worth noting that in Singapore, as in many of the Asian markets that you'll work with, social media and other connections are critically important. Almost every meeting that I would go to in a Singapore context will finish with someone reaching out to me on LinkedIn, finding me on other social media channels, and automatically making that connection, building that network. It's something that we don't do as often in an Australian context. So having that as this additional mind, this lens that you're looking through is also going to be really helpful and useful in terms of thinking about the most effective channels for communication. One of the other things that it might be useful then just to look at now is how we see that map play out totally across those dimensions. And I guess the thing that you might want to think about if you did go through and mark yourself in terms of where do I fit on that dimension, where do I think Australia might fit and where does Singapore fit, is what you're seeing here is that collated mapping. And so what you notice is that the biggest differences, the ones that we've just talked about now, are that egalitarian versus status. So this piece of whether I should focus on everybody being equal or whether I need to recognise the lay of the land. I guess I'd ask you just to reflect for a minute on some of the meetings that you might have had. Bear in mind that when you're setting up meetings in Singapore, typically you might be working through an EA, you might be working through a junior member, you might be setting up those meetings in one way and then, of course, meeting with somebody who's more senior. In our Australian way, we do like to be incredibly friendly with everybody that we've met. And so that second meeting where you're meeting your most senior person for the first time, you may have already built rapport or connection with some of the other folks that you've been involved with. It's really important to just kind of step back from everybody's on the same page or we're treating everybody equally, to think about how do you show respect, how do you connect in that context with those new and more senior people. For those of us who will have the chance to travel to Singapore, which hasn't been recent and might not be in the next little while, the other things that are important are really just quite simple business etiquette, and I thought it might be useful just to share a few of those things. We've become increasingly without business cards here in Australia, but given what I've just shared, which is that importance of kind of understanding the hierarchy and where people fit in, a business card does a lot of things. It shares who you are, it shares what you do, and it shares where you fit in. Handing across of business cards, many of you will have seen that already. The business card is a representation in some ways of that importance, that sense of state, sort of sense of self. And so having clean business cards, having accurate business cards with your right information on is really important. If you're going to be spending a lot of time in Singapore, you might want to think about having a Chinese translation of your business card on the reversed side so that you've got both those options. When you receive a business card, take a minute to take a look at it and acknowledge. And then when you're, when you've taken that moment, it's also important just to kind of place your cards somewhere where you're able to see them, where they're treated with some sense of respect. I guess just a few other things in terms of, we mentioned already just the importance of being well prepared. When you meet with a Singapore potential partner or client organisation, they will probably know more about your business than maybe even some of your extended team do. So being aware that people will know that they will have done some research is important. So having clarity of your agenda and also having done the same sets you in good stead for doing those kinds of things. And I guess some of the other important things to think about are just the way we dress and the way we present ourselves. Singaporean business culture is certainly slightly more formal than we would have typically experiencing here in Australia. So from the smallest things in terms of the way we dress, the language that we use, dial up your formality rather than dial down. Recognize that relationships and connections and family are important. So focusing on those, finding ways to come, to go beyond the task initially is important. Given that, there are just a couple of other things that you will notice, and it's probably interesting to share. One of the sort of things that we've seen a lot of in terms of those of you who've travelled to Singapore in the past, there is the sense of it's important to be successful. And historically, that's been around material success. And there's a little bit of a joke around the 5 C's of Singapore. You know, you need to be cashed up to have your car, your credit card, your condo, and your country club membership. And that was coined as a bit of a joke. What you will see is that Singapore is changing very quickly. And so you've got a whole generation of Singaporeans who are starting, it's 50 years, 55 years actually, since independence. It's 55 years since you've seen this incredible journey from third world to first world. It's taken a huge amount of focus, this kiasu sense, this real fear of missing out, and this driven focus on always striving, always moving forward, never wanting to be left behind, has taken some toll on the next generation of Singaporeans. So you're seeing a next generation who are starting to breathe out a little, a generation that's become more comfortable in their place in the world, and a generation that's starting to look at some of the other values which perhaps have historically been important and are increasingly becoming important moving forward. So what you see now is more of a focus on some of those, yes, career and progress and financial success are still very important, but we also see more focus on some of the community values, some of that desire to make a difference, some of that desire to kind of leave a legacy and do things for the next generation. And I kind of connect to that as a final point in the sense of when you think about your products, particularly in the organic space, and you think about some of these emerging values around a greater good, around a connection to community, around wanting to do the right thing, that does open up some avenues for really appealing to deeply ingrained values and preferences that a Singapore community might have. And when you think about that, it gives you some openings in terms of how you might like to progress moving forward. Definitely quite a quick run through. I'm aware that we've just hit 12 o'clock and we wanted to leave a bit of time for Q&A. As we summarise, I guess the key things that we might just invite you to do is in 60 minutes, there are 3 quick things that we really looked to do, which is really just give you a bit of a sense of the history and the origins of Singapore. It is an important part of that story of where Singapore's come from in terms of where Singapore is today. The second thing was really then just to give a bit of a sense of a couple of frameworks that you can use when you're thinking about, so if I'm working in a Singapore context, how do I think about engaging in a way that's appropriate? So that iceberg, the 10% of what you're seeing above the line, but the 90% of what's below the line is really being driven by a whole set of values and beliefs which frame what it is to be successful, what's important, and what to focus on. At Asialink Business, we've developed a series of country starter packs, and they're all available on our website, free for you to download. So the country starter pack for Singapore will give you some more insights into beyond just working within the culture, a bit more depth around some of the context for the market, some of the consumer perceptions, and also some of the frameworks and infrastructure that you could connect into. I know the team will share a bit more of that shortly, but that's a really great resource for you to move to. For those of you who are interested in the other markets, we'll also have the chance to run through those. You'll see that we've got a series of, a number of those markets covered in this country. So look, I'm going to take a break. I'd love to hear a few words of things that are coming up for you as you listen to that session. Anything that perhaps surprised you first off would be useful and interesting to hear, and any questions that you might have. Thanks, Tara. No questions. Thanks, Katrina. Sherry, if there are no other questions, Sherry, I'll hand back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was terrific. We'll take a short break now and come back for the second part of today. We might just take 10 minutes. Najib, hopefully that suits you. We're going to bring you on a little bit earlier. Is that okay?
I'm ready.
Perfect. Okay, so if we can all just take a break and come back 12:15 Brisbane time, that would be great. See you again soon. Okay, welcome back everybody. Thank you. I hope you got time to have a comfort break and get a cup of tea. I'll hand over to Najib now for the second part. Najib has over 25 years experience in exporting and we look forward to hearing all about it. Thank you, Najib.
Thanks, Shari. To qualify, 25 years meant that I started when I was 10 years old. So you're never too young to start. Well, welcome everyone to this section of today's Export Masterclass, focusing on the Singapore market. Thank you, Catherine, for such a detailed analysis on the cultural aspects of the Singapore market and Singaporeans. You know, certainly in my dealings with buyers in food and beverages, you find that retail buyers don't have any patience. They want to get straight to the point. It's pretty transactional. Relationships are better. But when you're dealing with distributors, definitely relationships are very important, especially the family-owned distributor businesses. There, you really do need to invest the time to get to know who you're working with. So, by Catherine's definitions, I guess she was covering the CQ part, and she defined the IQ part as being knowledge. So I guess I'm delivering the IQ part. So no pressure there on me. Just very quick housekeeping. As a reminder, this part is being recorded, and there is a Q&A function that you can use to ask questions. I have my team with me here. I've got in particular Ujan Pad and Rajeshwari, who will be able to take any questions that you may have. If there's any issue with the slides showing up on your screen, or if you drop out for any reason and you need some technical help. And also they will be passing the questions on to me for me to be able to answer them either as we go along or at the end of the session. I may answer them then. We've got quite a lot to get through and some pretty exciting stuff. But we will endeavor to answer all the questions that come on. For those of you that don't know who Export Connect is, we are a young business. We are now we're coming to 4 years in June, and in the time that we've been around, we've delivered more than 180 projects for more than 120 clients, covering 20 markets. We're not new to workshops. We're approaching 100 now, of which almost the last quarter have all been delivered virtually. Clients we've done work for are big companies such as Chobani and Simplot and Woolworths. But actually, most of the companies we help are in the SME range. And how we help is by providing the market insights, the competitor reviews, the market entry strategies, pitch development, and connections to pre-qualified buyers to help build successful, sustainable and successful export businesses. So in this agenda, essentially what we're doing is a market selection analysis. So we're going to have a consumer overview. Well, we're going to have a little bit of an economic overview, which some of it will overlap a little bit with Catherine's slides, but it'll be in the context of how we build a market selection scorecard. So a little bit of a spoiler. At the end of this, we'll show you how you take all the data that we're about to share with you and use it to score the relevance of the market to your product and your business. To do that, we're going to do a consumer overview, channel overview, category-specific reviews. We're going to do some in-market competitor reviews and how you go about doing it, and then also we'll let you know, what kind of support is available along the way. From a market selection perspective, you need to know the economic indicators of a market. You want to know if it's growing, if it's contracting, if it's big, if it's small, GDP per capita, things like that. You need to understand the demographic, which is, cultural backgrounds. One of the things we know from Catherine having shared is that Singapore is a culturally diverse country with, very strong Chinese influence, but then you've got people from all around the world living there. We look at consumer trends. We need to look at the market size. Market size is not particularly big when you think about the Singaporean market, but you've got to look at the growth prospects as well. Where is it heading? You've got to look at your category size within the market. and what are its growth prospects and what are its trends. Then look at the channel trends. Is your product most suited to retail? Then what's happening in retail? Is it most suited to food service? What's happening there? Is e-commerce, is your product a durable product that could potentially go through the e-commerce channel? Or do you need to have a mix across all? Who are your competitors in market? What's the dispersion rates? I mean, there we know that Fair Price and cold storage dominate the retail sector, but there are smaller stores as well, you know, such as Little Farms and Ryan's Grocer and the like. We need to look at trade data. Where is Singapore sourcing the category of products that you produce? And in doing that study, have a look and see where is most of the products from your category being exported to, other than Singapore. Got to consider market access, which for Singapore is, you know, a delight. Free trade agreements, of which they're part of one, but there's no duty anyway. And then look at what kind of certifications are required. So these are all the factors that you need to consider when assessing the relevance and viability of a market for your product. So let's start assessing. From a consumer perspective, let's first of all look at the economic indicators before we get into the consumer part. So we see, and we compare it with Australia just to give you context. And over the course of you know, all the workshops that we'll be doing, we will always do that, give a context back to Australia. So the Singapore market GDP is much smaller than Australia's, which makes sense considering that the population is much smaller as well. The GDP annual growth rate is minus 2.4%. So COVID has hit Singapore very hard, but it's on a road to recovery. Not as strong as Australia's, but it's on its way. GDP per capita is 58,000 US. In Australia, it's 57,000 US, so slightly ahead. Ease of doing business in Singapore is fantastic. And I think Catherine mentioned you could even open a company in 15 minutes. Australia is not bad either, of course, 14th out of 190, but it's just showing you how advanced the Singapore market is. And from a logistics performance indicator perspective, it's right up there in the top 10. So 7 out of 160, which Singapore is a bit of a re-export hub to the ASEAN region. So you would expect it to be quite high. When we compare Singapore more broadly across Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, so some of its ASEAN neighbors, you can see Indonesia's GDP is significantly larger than Singapore's, but its population is also significantly larger. And so then when you look at it from a GDP per capita perspective, Indonesia, along with Vietnam, are quite poor. So when you look at Singapore, what you do know is that you have affluent consumers with disposable incomes and, as we will find out, a willingness to spend as long as it demonstrates value. When we look at one of the interesting things to see there from a GDP annual growth rate perspective is that Vietnam is positive and every other market there is negative. So Vietnam has not been as severely impacted by COVID as any of the other markets across Asia. So Vietnam could be a market of interest to many of you. When we look at Economic Freedom Index, Ease of Doing Business, and Logistics Performance Index, these are mostly just to see whether these are going to be markets that are going to be difficult for us to trial or not. And why we do that is because if you're new to export, you don't want to go to a very complicated market. You want to go to a market that is going to be easy to understand, easy to operate in, and have the least amount of hurdles to jump. And what we see here, when you look at Singapore in comparison to its neighbors, although its population is smaller, it's actually rates very highly in being able to deal with it. And so that's why I think many businesses that are new to export or have been exporting accidentally and now want to export strategically are looking to Singapore as one of the first markets to go to. It's an open economy, so 35 plus bilateral investment treaties, 30 plus treaties with investment provisions. There are bilateral trade partners, and and of course we've got the Australia-Singapore FTA. All this really means is it's an open economy and one that we can work with less complexity than some of the other markets. When we look at the demographic, small population, 5.7 million. Australia is, almost 5 times that. We know, however, that the urban population is 100%. Why that's important for us is wherever you have an urban population, you have shopping centers, and wherever you have shopping centers, you have supermarkets and hypermarkets and convenience stores and built up populations. And our products are suited to A-class supermarket chains. So that's where we need to see urban populations. It gives us the confidence to know that that our target segments are present. We've got the education index, which Singapore is quite high, along with the human development index, and life expectancy is high too. So again, demonstrates a market that is educated, that is concerned about its health, and that would be more willing to purchase organic products and products that are all natural and better for you, functional. This is a snapshot across the region. Similarly, as we did for the economy, from a demographic perspective, and we see the population size is a negative, because it is such a tiny. It's 5.7 million. It has less people than New South Wales, but it is all urban, and all the ease of doing business type indicators are the highest amongst its neighbours. When we look at the consumer characteristics, we've highlighted in red the common characteristics with Australians. And so you'll see there's way more common characteristics than not. So what this would suggest is that if you understand who your target customer is in Australia, it's quite likely that it's the same kind of target customer in the market overseas, and may most likely have the same behaviors around what are their hates, what are their likes, what are their lifestyles. So we know that, they're high income, we know that they're urban, we know that they're looking for healthier ways of living, we know that they're educated, we know that quality of product is important, and convenience is being sought, and even more so now as a result of the pandemic. They're less likely to go to big shopping centers, and so they shop at the, sort of the local supermarket. Word of mouth is important, and they're highly engaged online. Some of the points of difference is that Australians are not brand loyal, whereas Singaporeans tend to be brand loyal. COVID has encouraged them to try new brands because product may have been out of stock, or maybe where they're now buying their products, they don't carry the brand that they usually buy because they perhaps used to go to a bigger store further out, and now they're not doing that. But generally speaking, they are loyal to brands. They are price conscious. So while they do have propensity to spend, while their GDP per capita is strong, they are, they do value product. So they won't pay anything for a product just because it's high quality. It has to present value to them. And they have a longer purchase cycle. So they tend to research what they're going to buy before they buy it. Whereas in Australia, we're more experience seeking. So when we look at the consumer trends in Singapore, we know that they're open to international products and local products, right? Now, most of what they consume from a food and beverage perspective and food and agri perspective is going to be imported. I think it's something like over 95% of what they consume is imported. So that makes Singapore an attractive market for us because we have a captive audience. They have to bring in food from overseas to be able to survive. But what it also means with the diverse population that they have, streaming across so many different cultures, is that supermarkets and food service and e-commerce channels are all looking to bring in foods from all over the world because they have consumers from all over. The people who live in Singapore are from all over the world. And then you've got the local consumers are trialing all these international products too. So they are interested in international and local products. As mentioned, they shop, value for money is very important for them. They are prepared to pay more for better quality products, healthier products, better for you products, but there has to be value for them to buy it. And what we know is COVID has seen, there was already, organic product was already growing in demand prior to the pandemic, but that's just accelerated that growth. And you know, and in particular, what you see 83% of Singaporeans wanting to buy health supplements, in addition to purchasing more fresh and natural product. From a purchasing decision perspective, we know that word of mouth is particularly important in Singapore, but we also know that they do their research online. So, you know, when we look at a report issued by Global Web Index, we've got 36% of purchases have been researched online, and 35% have been through word of mouth. And when we look at advertisements that have been on almost 30% of those that they've responded to have been through social media, which almost matches TV advertising, and then online retail websites also about a third. So these are the top 5 sources from which they use to research their purchasing decisions. Now, rewards are also quite important. These do influence and are motivators for Singaporean consumers to buy products and to advocate a brand online. And we know that 80% of consumers are willing to pay more for environmentally friendly and sustainable materials. That was a survey done by Nielsen in 2019. And, you know, with heightened interest in sustainable products, we know that that percentage is only going to grow. So if we have a look at the impact of COVID, just overall, as in general, for the Singapore market, we know that the economy contracted. It contracted by as much as 13.2% in the second quarter of 2020. We know that tourism it's been crushed. Visitation is down 83% year on year from January 2020 through to the end of October. We know that median monthly household incomes have dropped by a modest 2.5%, but nonetheless, they've dropped. Unemployment is at a 16-year high. But we also know that cooking at home is on the rise, right? So do-it-yourself, eat-at-home options are on the rise. And we know that the drop in income is translating into tighter budgets. And so for some, this means also tightening on their grocery spend, which in part is from reducing their food service consumption, but for others is looking for better value in their purchases from supermarkets, from the retail channel. And then this is just highlighting that 83% drop in movements. Why this is important is because Singapore is a bit of a transient country. A lot of travel passes through Singapore, and so that means that it's a very important income stream for the country. What it also means, and when travel comes back again, is that it's a great showcase market for foods and beverages. So if you are able to be successful in getting your product into cold storage or Fair Price, or into Singapore Airport, Little Farms, you know, any of these different places, buyers from across the ASEAN region in particular all sort of come into Singapore as part of their travel, but also they will then go and have a look at what's on shelf. And if they see your product there and it's of interest to them, they'll reach out. They'll check your website and write through info or whatever it may be. So being a transient country and being a hub for travel, with it having crashed, is terrible for the Singaporean economy. But when it comes back, is an opportunity for food and beverage companies. When we look at the channel overview for Singapore, we see that grocery retailing makes up is 6.25 billion US dollars. And so within grocery retailing, we've got supermarkets and hypermarkets. We've got food service is $4.52 billion, and e-commerce as a whole is 3.31. So that's not e-commerce grocery. That's e-commerce as a whole. Grocery is only a fraction of that. We can see the growth rates for supermarkets was really quite high year on year for the last 5 years, but we see that it fell. Well, the forecast growth is for it to fall, but it will increase. So there'll be the biggest increase will be in decrease is in the most recent years, and then it'll start tapering back up again until it averages to -2% year on year for the next 5 years. And that's just because of that consciousness of not going out into places where there's a lot of people. Hypermarkets has had very modest growth, and it'll have modest negative growth over the next 5 years. Food service is expected to pick up year on year over the next 5 years, but coming off a lower base because of the hit that COVID had on food service. So you see, averaged out year on year over the last 5 years, food service is down -0.64%. But the statistic for year on year for the last 5 years before COVID hit was positive figures. So to be -6.4 just shows how dramatic the drop was in 2020. E-commerce is the shining light. It's experienced massive growth year on year over the last 5 years, in particular heightened during COVID, and it's forecast to continue to grow, not at the same rate, but still anticipated to continue to grow, to the point that e-commerce as a whole will challenge grocery retailing. When we look at grocery retailing, we know that there was, a little bit of a panic buying when COVID hit, and so any product with long shelf life sold exceptionally well. But then, the panic buying got under control pretty quickly. We've also seen there was already a trend, generally speaking, before COVID, for supermarket chains to be opening smaller stores, located more in sort of neighborhood areas. Now, what's happened is convenience stores are in the same boat, but what we're seeing is with consumers less likely to go out to the big shopping centers to avoid being infected by COVID, they are now shopping in their local stores, which tend to be smaller and convenience stores, neighborhood grocers, and the type. The distribution of organic food in Singapore is quite narrow. It's not a very big market. It's not a very big segment, and the majority of organic products in Singapore are sold through supermarkets and organic specialist stores, but we are seeing a bit of a shift into the e-commerce space as well, with some, and we'll see in the slide later on, some of the platforms that are particularly strong in organic e-commerce retailing. Cold Storage and Fair Price have invested a lot in their e-commerce platforms, and so as a result, you'll see a lot of e-commerce products and food and grocery in general being sold on their platforms. But other places where you tend to find organic products are Marketplace, which is sort of the upscale dairy farm banner, Little Farms, which tends to list a lot of Australian products, Ryan Grocers lists a lot of Australian products too, Supernature, and a whole bunch of others. From a food service trend perspective, as I mentioned, it had a massive hit. A March 2020 survey, so they surveyed 250 restaurants, and so this was done by a reservation platform. It found that 93% of the restaurants had experienced a fall in revenue as early as March 2020, and 78% of those operators didn't think that they would last longer than 6 months if that kind of drop continued. And almost all of them had to reduce staff or ask them to, take leave. So prior to COVID, Singaporeans were well known for eating out a lot, and at full service restaurants, like quick service restaurants were also growing, and there was a lot of demand for quick service restaurant meals, but COVID put a big hole in that, and so now there's a lot of the home delivery, Deliveroo type Uber Eats setup, but food service has not recovered. It has not recovered in Singapore, and it will recover. It's expected to shift positively, but it's going to take a bit of time. From a cuisine perspective, the Singaporeans always do have that sort of Asian taste bud. So, but they do go for Western foods, and sort of the innovation or trend prior to COVID was this mod Sing move, which is modern Singaporean cuisine. When we look at food service restaurants value breakdown, essentially the Asian full service restaurants, as I mentioned, that's their palette. That was the dominant by far. So 60% of the full service restaurants have an Asian cuisine of one type or another. Then you've got European full service and North American full service restaurants making up third and second, and then you see a little bit of a smattering between Latin American, Middle Eastern, pizza full service restaurants and other. From a limited service restaurant perspective, and this is more around quick service restaurants. The dominant there is burger limited restaurants, followed by chicken. The two combined are 46% and 18%. So that's over 60% just in those two. And then the rest are made up through convenience store limited service. So 7-Elevens and the like, they serve hot food, in the little sort of microwave options and heat options. So they are often, and they qualify as a quick service restaurant because of that. And then the rest of the options are all, make up the rest. From an e-commerce trend perspective, COVID, it was already growing prior to the pandemic. The pandemic certainly accelerated the interest in buying product through the e-commerce channel. We know that internet and smartphone penetration in Singapore is really quite high, and that Singaporeans are quite sophisticated. They do use it, and they engage in e-commerce. So food and beverage e-commerce sales grew by 8.6%. When you look at food and personal care online, to a value of $82 million. And we know that 37% of consumers are shopping more online during the year. Lazada, for example, one of the major platforms, experienced a 4 times increase in online grocery sales during 2020. You've got Shopee has got a dedicated Chinese marketplace, while when you look at Ryan's Grocers and Ryan's Grocer and Little Farms, they sell predominantly Australian products, in fact, for their customers who are looking for high quality and at times organic grocery items. So let's look at the categories. And so the categories we focused, we'll do like sort of a bit of an overview here, and then we'll go into the categories that for which the majority of the participants attending this webinar are from. So when we look at organic packaged food, and so these are for statistics coming in to, I think it's up to about August or September 2020. Yeah. So part of these statistics will include the COVID era, pandemic era. So we see baby food has grown by 4.3% year on year. The forecast is forecast to grow year on year by 4.3% over the next 5 years. The category value is quite low. So organic category values we'll see tend to be quite low because it is still a smallish segment in the market. We see breakfast cereals having growth of 3.5%. Wherever we see growth of about 3% or more, we tend to find that that's interesting for us. Confectionery is almost there. Edible oils are close to 5%. There seems to be, really good growth coming in, albeit from a much smaller base for organic frozen meat, seafood, fruit and vegetables. Rice, pasta, noodles has a good size for organic products relative to the other categories, and looking to experience strong growth as well. From a beverage perspective, we can see that organic coffee is at a higher level than many of the categories we saw in the food space. With modest growth, organic tea is going to have actually a slight decline, according to Euromonitor, year on year over the next 5 years. But it is at a value of $127 million. So again, higher value. When we look at breakfast cereals, and you'll see there on the right, we've got key market players. So we don't just focus on organic products, we focus on who the key market players are. And it's quite interesting within the breakfast cereal space that Nature's Path actually makes it. So it must be doing some decent volume to make that list of key market players. So COVID's it's had a mixed impact on breakfast cereals. So you've got the high income sort of households. They're looking for healthier foods, and so some of them are going to the healthier cereals that tend to have high in nutrition. But when you look at the rest of the consumers who can't afford the cereals that have the high in nutrition, they're moving away from cereals altogether. So really, when you look at from an organic, but even as a category as a whole, to play in a space where the category is growing, and that's where we want to be. We don't want to be looking to get into a market where we will be replacing another brand. We want to be going into a market where our category is growing and we can contribute to that growth, play our part in the growing segment. So otherwise, if you're replacing another product because you're cheaper, then sure enough, at some point down the line, the buyers will drop your product and buy another one because it's cheaper. So you want to participate in a growing area. And the growing segment within breakfast cereal space is in products that are immune boosting, better for you, more innovative, being organic, of course, but presenting healthy options for the Singaporean consumer. When we look at the trade data for breakfast cereals, so this is looking at the harmonized code number of 1904. Now, what harmonized commodity code numbers is a label, a numeric label that's assigned to different categories of products that are assigned by the exporting country and the importing country, that allows us to measure how much is going out, and it also allows to have things like what tariffs are applied and what documentation, certification and things like that are required. So for the purposes of this exercise, we've used the code 1904. So that's at a high level. These codes can go up to 8 digits. And for this is looking at prepared foods obtained by swelling or roasting of cereals or cereal products, right? So according to Singapore's IE Singapore Statistics, which is the one who records the movement of product according to HS codes, about $3.32 million worth of Australian products have entered the Singapore market, making us the 4th largest source of breakfast cereals under code 1904. The majority of their breakfast cereals come in from Malaysia, then the US, Thailand. After Australia, it's UK, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. So a very strong representation of ASEAN and North Asian markets there, with Australia, US, and UK being the main differentiators. When we look at where most of the breakfast cereals from Australia are exported to, New Zealand is the highest, followed by China, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and Singapore comes in 5th. So pretty important market, certainly if you're a breakfast cereal producer. What's also interesting here is sometimes when you look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures, so they're the ones who measure the export values according to HS codes. They sometimes don't match up when you look at the ABS statistics with the importing country statistics, but here it's quite close. We've measured it as 3.38 million going out, and Singapore has measured it at 3.32 million going out. So the difference there may just be a timing factor. Baby food is another category that we'll look at from a category perspective, given that quite a few of you on this call have baby food products. So infant formula is higher value, of course, but it's actually a difficult category to work with in Singapore. First of all, there's so much regulation around baby food in terms of what you can and can't say on the outer packaging. There's also a ban on online sales of milk formula that target babies under 6 months of age. So you've also got the government who is encouraging mothers to breastfeed their children. There's a very strong sort of campaign going out about feeding their children breastfed rather than using infant formula. And so despite that, there is a move towards organic baby food, as in, the purees and the like. Because that's not as difficult to comply to the regulatory requirements to get product in. And there's a growing interest because of the fact that they also want their babies to be healthier. And so anyone that's producing sort of an organic, better for you type baby food is getting good traction in the market. And there's certainly interest from retailers in stocking better for you baby foods. When we look at the code for baby food, so here we've had to be a little bit more specific, and so the code there you'll see is a couple of digits longer, so it's 190110. The value according to the Singapore stats of Australian exports to Singapore is $992,000 US, and that puts Australia as the fourth largest import source into Singapore, according to the Singaporeans. The majority of the product is coming in from Netherlands, Ireland, Switzerland, Australia and New Zealand. This includes infant formula, by the way. And when we look at this code for where we mostly export product to, China is the largest by far, okay, so that's obviously clearly heavily dominated by infant formula. Then Hong Kong, which a lot of that would be re-export, not just for the market itself. Then you've got Taiwan, Vietnam, South Korea. So Singapore comes in at 9th. Now what's interesting there, from the ABS documents exports to Singapore as 1.44 million, and Singapore records it as imports of 992,000. So there's a little bit of an anomaly there, and it could be because some of that product is coming into Singapore bonded and re-exported. So it actually doesn't go into the market. When we look at fresh fruit and vegetables, demand has gone up. Again, this whole idea around having to eat foods that boost your immunity and your health, nutrition, is seen a resurgence in the consumption of fresh produce. High-end supermarkets are, the strongest in this. So Fair Price, Finest, and Marketplace is where you often see it. We do know that fresh produce is being sold more and more through the e-commerce channels as well. Supply chains are quite strong in Singapore, and so maintaining the integrity of the product is quite likely. It doesn't get compromised too much. But there is also a willingness of the consumers to purchase packaged forms. So we know there's like strong demand for frozen fruits and for frozen vegetables. We know that when the pandemic first hit, one of our clients, who's a big producer of frozen vegetables, received something like 20 times 40-foot container order from Fair Price, as ordered by the Singaporean government, all prepaid. and they couldn't supply them because there wouldn't have been enough stock for the Australian market, which itself was experiencing hoarding at the supermarkets, so panic buying. So yeah, so there is now also, apart from looking for fresh fruit and vegetables, demand for frozen fruits and vegetables, especially those that can demonstrate that they've been snap frozen, again, to demonstrate that, you know, to make them feel like once it thaws that it's pretty much fresh. There's a demand for that kind of product. Here we look at a very high level code, just 07, so 2 out of a possible 8. So that includes a lot of vegetables. That also includes, you know, roots and tubers. So the IE Singapore for this code 07 documents imports from Australia at about $500 million, a little over $500 million US dollars, and that makes Australia the 3rd largest source of such ingredients. And when you have a look at where of product, and when you have a look at who the other main sources are, they tend to be cheaper producing markets of Malaysia, China, Thailand, India, you know, Vietnam. So definitely Australia comes in highest there in terms of an import source. And then when we look at our key export markets for these products, and this includes, you know, chickpeas, and beans. So we see most of it goes actually to Bangladesh, Egypt, UAE, Pakistan, you know, Sri Lanka. So Singapore still, as a developed market, is quite up there at 38 million. Sorry, that the value at the top of 565 million, that's not what it is. It's actually 43.38 million. We just didn't copy it over. For fruits and nuts, so when we look at a HS code of 08, so this is, you know, edible fruits and nuts. So it's not just fruits. There's nuts in there too. We've got the Singapore import value from Australia is 71 million. So again, sorry, I don't think we got that number there right on there. It's 71 million, but it puts us in as 4th largest. So the largest comes in from the US, followed by Malaysia, China, then Australia, right? And when we look at the code 08, where we mostly export product to, most of it goes to China, Japan, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and Singapore is our 8th largest destination of product, as categorized 08 harmonized code number. So a pretty important market for Australian producers. So you might say, okay, well, that's great, Najib. I mean, you know, good to have all this information. Where do you get it from? Well, there are so many sources that you can get this information from, and it is sort of, you do need to spend a lot of time, you know, researching. I mean, one of the reasons why Export Connect gets called in to help businesses is because they don't have the time to do all this research. But if you were to look it up, you can get a lot of it from Euromonitor. You can, you know, Asialink has some information, some stats. I mean, you saw earlier on, Catherine shared some of the economic and demographic data. You can go to Statista, Mintel. Many of these, you know, you've got to pay for them. They don't come for free. Nielsen is, you know, particularly quite expensive. Austrade has market insights that you can use. Export Council of Australia sometimes has information around free trade agreements and the like. International Trade Centre has the trade data, where you can see what product is being imported into the market and where are we sending our product out. Trade Organic, so that's the sort of the portal for Australian Organic Limited, is populating it with, they're populating that page with insights and information that you can also draw upon as well. So these are just some examples of places where you can go to get information. And of course, you know, Export Connect, and we'll soon be launching our portal, which will have competitor data and market data and training videos too. So in-market competitor review, right? So we've looked at the economic data, we've looked at the demographic data. We are feeling good that the market is, you know, got the kind of target consumer that we're looking for. We've looked at the category data, and let's just say, for argument's sake, our category is showing good growth and good potential. So the next step for us, we've looked at the trade data, and understood that Singapore for our product is maybe, you know, we're in the top 10 sources in Singapore of that particular category. So we're feeling pretty good about Singapore, but we still cannot be certain that we want to go there. The next step we need to do is to understand who the competitors are in market, because if we don't have any point of difference, then we can't participate in the growth of that category in Singapore. All we'll be doing is going in like for like, and almost always when you're competing on like for like, the lowest common denominator is price. You don't want to be competing on price. So we need to see who's in market. Now, when assessing who our competitors are in market, we have to look at their, you know, we have to take into account, you know, obviously their brand name. So this is, you need to document this, and, you know, ideally put it in an Excel spreadsheet so you're able to sort it according to many different sort of key criteria. So you need the brand name, you need the product photo, so you need to see what it looks like, what weight it is, obviously the price, and then do the conversion. And then you look at the price divided by the weight to determine the value for money on a per gram or per milliliter basis. What's the country of manufacture? You know, we want to be as much as possible comparing ourselves like for like. So, you know, we don't want to be comparing our product with a Chinese manufactured product, for example. We need to look at product claims. And of course, for us, it's seeing certified organic as a claim on the packaging. Comparing ourselves with conventional product, you know, is not ideal, because we'll always, or mostly, we will be more expensive. But being certified organic, we would hope in our proposition presents a value proposition to the consumer looking for cleaner and healthier products. What type of packaging is used? Is it glass? Is it plastic? Is it cardboard? What position in store? Is it in its own space on shelf in the category? Or is it also found in the deli or at the cash counter or in a gondola end? Promotions being held? Is there any discounting or bundling going on? Are they maybe sampling the product? You know, you need to document that kind of information when reviewing your competitors. The good thing about Singapore is that they typically have the importer's details on the packaging. So it'll either be on the pack itself or on an over label, and it has the importer's details. So sometimes you see the importer as the supermarket chain itself, and that means it's been a direct import. But usually, you know, you see who the distributor is as well, and who the importer is. You want to take a photo of the category so that when you come back home, or in the case of now, we're doing everything virtually, you know, you want to see, and if you're able to get access to an image of the category, where all the products fit and sit. If your product is suitable for food service, you also want to have a look at a restaurant menu. So if your product is particularly targeting high-end restaurants, research who the high-end restaurants are in Singapore. Have a look at their menus. Almost all of their menus are available online. And typically they would say in the menu where the cut of Wagyu comes from, or where you know, the lobster comes from, or where the scallops come from. Have a look at the menu to have, you know, to get a feel for where they're mostly sourcing their products from. When we can travel, you can always ask wait staff, and they'll give you, you know, they sometimes have information around where the source is, what's the most popular dish. You know, have they used different sources, country sources for that particular ingredient? And then if you've had a look at restaurants, if you had a look at e-commerce platforms, and if you've had a look at retail stores, then aggregate all the information and compare across channels and see what kind of theme are you seeing, and is there a place for you to play in the market. So here, when we look at organic breakfast cereals, for example, we can see, you know, Nature's Path, we know comes from the US, and we know it does very good volume. And so there you can see their organic, you know, cornflakes that with honey, infused with honey, for 300 grams, sell for $7.60 Australian. How much would your product sell for in the market if you've got a similar type product? And do you have any points of difference? Right? Can you be able to articulate a value for money to the consumers when you're negotiating with buyers? you know, from Switzerland, we can see their 375 gram product selling at $7.30. $13.50 for a product from Singapore, but it's 750 grams. So, you know, these are some products here from Spain, from Italy, from the UK. From an organic baby food perspective, we can see product there for Bubs products, 125 grams selling for $5.80. Brook Farm, 120 grams at $6.40. And so, you know, for Brook Farm, there's going to need to be the ability to articulate why should someone pay 60 cents more for their product than for the Bubs product. From the US, product at $6.90. So you can see product is generally around the same until you get to the product from the UK. So Ella's Kitchen, $3.85 for 100 gram. And you've got the HIP, which is coming from Germany, at $3.40 in a glass jar. So you need to understand, what do they all offer and how are you different? And how do you compare from a value proposition perspective? Here we've got, so these are fruits and vegetables. So we've got apples, we've got kiwi fruits. You sort of see the pricing there. You can see that a lot of it is also is packaged, either cryovac packed or in you know, boxes. We did some work with Eco Bananas to put their 4 bananas. So that's the red tip bananas that you see in the supermarkets. Put 4 bananas into a box, kind of like a muesli box. So instead of having a muesli bar in it, there's a banana in it. And the reception from the market was exceptional because they were able to articulate the benefits of red tip bananas, which essentially is, you know, it's easier to digest. It's got higher brick levels. It's got it lasts longer. So, you know, think about innovative ways in which you can package your product. Now, it definitely wasn't the cheapest banana on the shelf. In fact, it was the most expensive by a bit. But we felt that we were able to demonstrate that value by the benefits of the red tip banana, and in particular, the way that it was packaged. And so what you want to do is end up with kind of like a spreadsheet like this. So here, the example we're giving is of baby food in Indonesia. So this is one where we had already done it, so we didn't have to recreate one specifically for the Singapore market. And so there you've got all the key elements listed to be able for you to then later on go through and determine value, sort by different columns, and then determine the value proposition. So we've got the outlet that was visited, you know, the product name, the weight, the price, conversion into Australian dollars. Then we put in a price, which would be your landed price, and then averaged it out, divided it by the number of grams, and then compared it against your competitor. And were you cheaper or were you more expensive? And where you were cheaper, then, you know, that's great. That makes the value proposition a lot easier. If you're more expensive, then you need to be able to articulate why. And so in this particular example, a product that were cheaper, the Cerelac Nestle product, is manufactured in Indonesia. So we would have argued there, look, they're 12% cheaper, but they're manufactured in Indonesia. Our product would be fully imported from Australia. And so with that comes all the perceptions of better quality, better product. And we feel that paying a premium of 15% is acceptable. When we do our, and then typically what we do with this also is, you know, we've got all the product photos. We just haven't put it here because it wouldn't fit all on the slide, but then you sort of file all the photos as well so you can see what the product looks like. Then when you do an online competitor review, similar, right? When you put the outlet essentially is the online platform. And then you've got the product name, you can slot in the product image. So it's easier to do it here because when you do it on shelf, you're actually taking a photo and it's a much bigger document. So you need to store that separately. You look at what category it is within the baby food. So here it's baby food puree, the weight, the price, the conversion, where's the product coming from, and what product claims do they have, and are they on promotion? So in this particular case, we can see that 2 of the products at Big C were on promotion. This, by the way, is in Thailand, in Bangkok. And so then the idea is, Once you've done the economic review, you've done the demographic review, you've looked at the channel trends, you've looked at the category trends and numbers, you've looked at the trade data, and you've looked at the competitor reviews, you can start listing and comparing which markets are best for you. So in this particular instance for baby food, when we look at it, we've got, when we're scoring the GDP growth rate, anything that is 5% or more growth rate, we give a perfect score of 10 out of 10. Anything that's at 0 or below, it just gets 1, and so you get the picture. GDP per capita, anything over $50,000 GDP per capita, we give a score of 10. Anything as it gets closer to 0, it's 1. Consumer trends, so here you need to give a judgment call. If the consumer trends towards your product, so they're looking for more convenient, healthier, better for you, organic type product, then, and if that's what you make, then you'd be closer to 5. When you do ease of doing business, if it's a market that's, you know, like Singapore, it'll be 10 out of 10, because it's in the top 10% of those that are scored. Then we look at channel trends. If your product is more favorable towards retail or more favorable towards e-commerce, then you may want to give it a higher score. If it's more favorable towards food service, maybe not so high, although we know in Singapore that it's going to come back eventually. Then you look at your category. And so in this particular case, we've just put in baby food instead of typing category. And so you look at the what's the sales value, retail sales value of baby food for the most recent report you can get. So in this particular instance, it was a 2019 one. Although for the slides that we shared earlier, when we provided the category data, that's all 2020 data. It's the most recent data you can get. So in this particular case, baby food is a big category when you take into account infant formula, which is very high value. So you give it 10 out of 10 if it's $1 billion or more. If the growth rate year on year over the next 5 years, the forecast growth rate is 5% or more, we'd give it a full 10 out of 10. You know, and if it's closer to 0%, then it's just a 1. We look at the trends again. You make a judgment call, and so we give that a rank out of 5 because it is a judgment call. Then we look at the import data, and is it favorable data for product coming out of Australia into that market, and what's the growth rate within that as well. Then you make a judgment call on the competitor review. When you review the products and say, here we only showed 6, and the example of the competitor review, we only showed a handful. When we work on client projects, we typically go for a minimum 100 competitors. We're currently working on a client that's very big in sports nutrition, and we've got 800 different brands we're comparing against in the Singapore market for them. SKUs, sorry, not brands, SKUs. So it's you know, you really need to be thorough. You really need to understand what your value proposition is in comparison to the competitors. And for me, competitor review is exceptionally important. It's probably the most important, not probably, it is the most important one when assessing whether the market is right for you or not. And so for our scoring criteria, we give that a score out of 30, whereas all the others are getting scores out of 10 or 5. Then once you do that across multiple markets, you're able to sort of argue on evidence-based data which markets are the most that you should prioritize. And so in this particular instance, we did it for Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Indonesia, and UAE. And at that point in time, so this could change, right? So this is, you know, we did this in 2019, also early last year. Singapore is not the best one. Hong Kong came up the highest with 87, but very closely followed by Singapore, and not too far behind that was Malaysia. UAE came in after that, then Thailand, and then Indonesia. So that's based on evidence, on stats, figures, looking at your competitors, and on, you know, on feel. So as we go through these workshops, because, you know, we're going to be doing so many of these masterclasses across different Asian markets, we'll keep bringing this up to remind you to after the workshops, do your homework, get your data. If you can't find your data and you need some help, by all means, reach out to us and we can help with that. And so then you'll be able to, by September, I think it is, score your category across 8 different markets and see which are the ones that you should prioritize. Now, this is from a statistical, this is from a research market selection perspective. What is it that you need to do, and where you're going to go to get your data? But then there's support available in terms of if you want to bring in help from a grants perspective, or if you want more insights or information from the markets. These are just some of the organizations that you could typically go to. So you've got Food South Australia is a great source if you happen to be in South Australia. Others include Food and Agribusiness Network. Of course, you've got Trade Organic, Australian Organic, TRQ, the different state government agencies. FIAL has Meet the Buyer events, and they've got their Australian online food catalogue. So these are sources that you could potentially go to. One of the things that I really want to make a point about the Singapore market is that they import just about everything that they consume from a food perspective. They have very little tariff, they have no tariffs and very little barriers for getting product in. Language, generally speaking, in almost all instances, is not a barrier. It's a hub for the ASEAN region. So either from a re-export perspective or from the perspective of travelers passing through Singapore, visiting the markets, seeing your product, making note of it, and traveling back out. The supply chains are very strong. Cold supply chains are very strong. They have educated consumers that have disposable incomes. They are looking for value for money, but if you can demonstrate that value for money by doing the right research and looking at who your competitors are and building a compelling proposition, it is, while a small market, an excellent market to get into, either when you're starting with exporting, or as you're growing your export business, or if you're already in Singapore, to give it a bit of focus and grow your exports in the market. So question here, Paul, for you is, in terms of from a support perspective, have you received any support from these organizations in the past? And you can have a multi choice. And then the second part of this is, we know that Australian Organic Ltd, we've got many more workshops lined up. In fact, there's one on the UK next week. There's going to be a market visit program to a European market that's going to be shared again in next week's Masterclass. It'll be either to the UK, Sweden, or Germany off the back of the Masterclasses delivered for those. And then after that, we've got more Asian markets and the UAE Masterclasses, along with the Trade Organic website. So questions here, have you received support from any of these organizations? So you can pick more than one. And would you like to participate in future AOL activities and programs? So that's just a straight yes or no. Here we go. So I think, have we got most of them in? Yeah, so just there's enough time to get a few more responses in. I think we've got about 60% in. So if you want to keep answering those. Okay, cool. That's most of them done. And then this one here, just for us to understand this module, how it was for you. If you could score your overall experience with this point, this part of the workshop, so we can know where we are in terms of the pitch of the information and the relevance for you. If you could score your overall experience with 1 being poor and 5 being excellent, if you can score the relevance and value of the content in this workshop and the online delivery. And we've got some questions also. So while you're doing that, I'll read out a question that we've received. I have an ice cream business and would like to know if it's exportable. How would I be able to make it appealing and desirable? All right. Well, you know, I guess the first thing to consider, and if you could just keep sending your poll results in, and I'll just have a look and see how we're traveling with the poll results. Are they mostly in? Yeah, we've got, okay, most of the poll results in. Perfect, thank you. And do we have any more poll questions? No, we can go straight to the Q&A. Okay. All right, so in that question there, what I would do is, first of all, I would want to study the ice cream market as a category in Singapore. Is it one that's growing? Is it not? Now, I don't know offhand if it is. I suspect it is. I know that we receive a lot of inquiries from Singapore buyers looking for Australian products. Ice cream is not one that we often get asked for, because also ice cream is it's got a very limited space in the supermarkets. But first thing you need to see is it a category that's growing? And then the second part you need to see is who are your competitors in the market, right? So are you competing with Harry's ice cream, or are you competing with Blue Ribbon? You know, are you at the niche end or the smaller end? What are your expectations and from the Singapore market in terms of KPIs? Right. So, I mean, we spoke about all the market selection criteria you need to consider when assessing the market you're going into. And we'll be doing that for every single one of this series. What you need to be able to determine before you even get to that is, what does export mean for your business? Now, if you want to be doing a couple of pallets a month, and that's good for your business because that's what your volume can take, then you may be able to think about going direct into cold storage or fair price through consolidations. Maybe you could end up sending some product to little farms, for example. But for you to be able to do that first, you need to see what are they currently selling and how are you different, and what kind of value proposition can you offer. So you got to take into account what do you want to achieve from a Singapore market perspective. What do you want it to mean for your business? And then you need to look at, is it a category that's growing? Who are your competitors? Can you articulate a point of difference? Can you present value? And then you can start making a call. Could you help us connect with actual? So we can help with connecting buyers and distributors in Singapore. That's a tricky question. Don't know whether the product is going to be good for the market and where to start. So the starting point is understanding the landscape of the market, your category, the trade data, the competitor information, and once you look at all of that in totality, maybe come up with a scorecard. That'll give you a feel for whether it'll be a strong market or not. I'm just conscious that we're starting at 1:22, so I think I stop now. All right, I've been told by my team to stop. I can keep going forever, but I'll behave and I'll do as I'm told. So Shari, back to you.
Thanks, Najib. That was great. Really good information in there. And thanks, everyone, for your participation with the polls and the Q&As. That really helps us a lot. Next up, we've got Owen, who's our Chief Technical Officer, just to finish off today's webinar series. Over to you, Owen.
Thank you, Shari, and thank you, Najib and Catherine, for some fantastic insights so far. Najib, you still on screen share? I'm Chief Technical Officer for Australian Organic Ltd, and I've been fortunate enough over the years to spend quite a bit of time in Singapore, working mostly in organic certification. So really great to hear all these insights, and can certainly confirm and add one little anecdote that I think the Singaporean people also have a very similar sense of humour to us, but perhaps don't go cracking jokes in your first formal meeting with them. So we've saved the most boring part to last, and that is the regulatory requirements for exporting organic produce into Singapore. And similar to a lot of other aspects of that market, it is one of the easier ones to export to. However, there are some requirements for making an organic claim on produce for export into Singapore, which we'll run through now. I'll just go to screen share. So there are two aspects to exporting organic produce to Singapore. One is getting it out of our country and then getting it into their country. So the exports of organic produce are regulated in Australia under the Export Control Act. Now you'll see on this slide 2020. So this new act actually hasn't come into place yet. It does come into place later this month. We're not aware of any reason that that will be delayed. So I'm not going to bother mentioning the old rules, the current rules technically. The new Export Control Act 2020 is what regulates any produce, any agricultural produce, and that includes processed product with the trade description of organic or biodynamic, and interestingly also biological and other similar label claims, but for the most part it's organic and biodynamic that are focused on. The way that they are regulated is that they are classified as prescribed goods under the Export Control Act. So as with any prescribed good, it is illegal to export them unless you have the appropriate approvals in place. So Export Control Act is what regulates it. Underneath the Export Control Act is the Export Control Rules. That used to be called the Organic Orders. You might still hear people refer to those as the Organic Orders. Organic biodynamic produce is a prescribed good, which means that it's illegal to export it without the appropriate approval. The new Export Control Act is in reality very similar to the old one in terms of day-to-day how you work with it. It's undergone some really important improvements, but the important aspects largely remain the same. A couple of important changes are that it now specifically references the national standard for organic and biodynamic produce within the Act. So the national standard is what your products and your manufacturing facilities here will need to be certified to prepare certified organic products that are going to be able to be exported legally. The national standard. And there's a picture of the front page there. Also in the new Act is an exclusion for cosmetics, a formal exclusion for cosmetics, and also for pet cosmetics. And that's especially relevant for Singapore because on the Singapore side, which we'll see in a second, the regulation of the word organic is only for food as well. So if you're in personal care, cosmetics type products, this information is not as relevant, still good to be aware of. So the way that you make your export of this prescribed good legal is you have approved a organic produce export certificate. And as of the 28th of March, this will be known as an organic goods certificate. So that's not the same as your organic certificate. This is a consignment by consignment certificate. So each consignment has to have an approved, the jargon currently is OPC, Organic Produce Export in brackets certificate, about to be known as OGCs. I'm sure there'll be a crossover where people use the terms interchangeably, but importantly, this is a document for each consignment, not just an organic certificate for an operator or for products. You'll need that as well, but each consignment it needs to be approved before, it needs to go with the shipment. So there's some planning involved in ensuring that you have an organic goods certificate authorized and going with the shipment. It can be tricky, especially with fresh air freight. So it's worth talking to your certification body. So all of the Australian organic certification bodies that are approved by the Department of Agriculture can issue these OGCs. So if you are, for instance, ACO certified processing facility already, you would just talk to ACO about getting your OGC and get to ask them specifically about their submission cutoff times so that you know you get that in, you get it approved. And all they do at their end is check that that product and formulation and label are currently certified. And then they're given the authority by the Department of Agriculture to actually sign off on those. So the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment are not directly involved in each organic goods certificate. Your certification body is, and all of the Australian organic certification bodies are authorised by the government to provide this. So now on the Singapore end, pardon me. For Singapore, there's no specific organic equivalence or organic trade agreement in place and nor required. It's regulated over there under the Sale of Food Act. And the only reference in their regulation now is under section 17, which is about truth in labelling. So in prior versions of their regulation, it actually specifically referenced the Codex Alimentarius Organic Standard. That is no longer in there. What has continued is that there's a requirement for a third-party organic certification, and the Singapore Food Agency may ask for that at any time, simply under section 17, which is just the truth in labelling clause that has remained. In my experience, they don't ask for it very often. However, to comply with federal law to get it out of the country, you'll have that organic goods certificate. So and that should go with the produce. So if they ever ask for it, it will be available. And as I've mentioned already, cosmetics are not included in the scope because it is a food act. So you've got to have a third-party certification, and they may check on that, but they generally at the import process, in my experience, they don't actually check even for an organic goods certificate. But just in case, you must have it there. Must have it there anyway under federal law here. A little bit more information on the market from my experience over there. There's not a specific logo for Singapore. There's no mandatory standard that they have over there that we have to comply with. You tend to, on the shelf there, see the USDA logo and the EU organic logo. They're the main government logos. You sometimes also see the IFOAM logo. Some of you may be aware of that acronym. It's International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements. It's not a specific requirement, but some customers over there, as in some supermarket chains, I believe, still like to see that. The BUD logo is also very common at the retail level. So if you're an ACO certified processor, for instance, using the BUD logo, that will cover your requirement for getting it out of the country and getting it in, and may well satisfy your customer there. But obviously you need to talk to your customer because the supermarket chain or the importer over that side may have their own preferences. The major supermarkets that I'm aware of in Singapore typically require their suppliers, so their wholesalers, especially for fresh produce, to have their own organic certification as well. Maybe not so much for grocery lines, but it is worth checking if your importer over there has a certification and if their customers are likely to want it as well. Hope that makes sense. And at the moment, so many of I think almost all of the organic fresh produce importers and wholesale distributors in Singapore are certified through ACO Certification Limited here in Australia because of the geographic proximity, I think, for conducting audits. Although now the audits are being conducted remotely by a video call due to the travel restrictions. Now that is all I have, but I'm very happy to take some questions.
Owen, I think there's a question there in the chat box that you can perhaps address from Anchor. Can you see that on your screen?
I can indeed, thank you. So thank you, Anchor. Is there a dollar threshold for organic products that need export approval? And if so, would it still be for smaller orders or e-commerce orders, is there an exception? The short answer is no. There is an allowance for samples. And under the new Act, I think it has remained at, it's actually a kilogram level, I think, but that's only for samples anyway. It has been used and I think misused over the years. So say, oh, it's under 10 kilos, so it's a retail sale, we'll send it direct. Technically, it's only for commercial samples and under 10 kilos. So the short answer is no, not a dollar value threshold. If you are exporting certified organic or any product making this, the trade description claim organic or biodynamic, you need an OPC, or what's now going to be called an organic goods certificate. I see another question. If that's fine with you, Shari, I'll go ahead onto that one.
Yeah, great.
So we have another question that says, we have products that have organic ingredients and are labelled as such, but the overall product is not organic certified. Does this mean that under the Prescribed Goods Act, it is now illegal to export these? So I won't give a definitive answer on this, but the way that, so I'd recommend you check out the Act and check out the new version, the Export Control Act and the, what's it called now? The Organic Goods Orders, to see some of the finer detail in there. But any trade description of organic brings it under the category of a prescribed good. So probably what would happen is if you didn't actually have it in the product name or in the brand name or in any of the commercial documentation, and organic claims were only on the ingredient panel, it would probably make it there okay. But whether that was technically legal, you definitely want to check out. I would lean towards saying that it would not be technically legal, but it's not a matter of now. I don't think it's changed under the new Act. It was probably already illegal. So, however, there is a category in the national standard specifically for products that have less than 70% organic ingredients are allowed to make a claim of organic on each of the ingredient panel products. So if it's technically compliant to the national standard, then you may still be able to have an organic goods certificate issued, even though it only has some organic ingredients. So sorry, it's a really complicated one. In fact, feel free to reach out directly if you want to discuss that further, but certainly check out the organic goods orders in more detail to be sure.
Thanks, Owen. I might just go back. There's one or two. Najib, if you're still there, if you wouldn't mind coming back on, I think you might be able to assist with one of these. Just a question from Katrina in regards to being able to access data for probiotic fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut.
So that kind of data would, you could get high level data. So, you know, it'd be in the sort of the condiments kind of space. And so you can see how the Singapore market is tracking from a condiments perspective. Is it a growing category? You would have to look at themes around the higher level because you know, fermented foods is really quite niche, and there won't be a lot of market data for fermented foods. So you would focus on what is its overarching, how is its overarching category performing, and condiments is performing well in Singapore. I can say that for a fact, and that's mostly because of the dining at home factor, and people are entertaining at home. Well, not entertaining, but they're eating more at home, and so they're wanting to replicate the eating out experience in the house. And then you would place a lot of weight on checking out who your competitors are in market. Where are those ingredients coming? Like, where's those products coming in from? What kind of claims, or I mean, probiotic, but like, you know, is like 1 billion, you know, probiotic. Like what kind of value are the competitors presenting that are already in market versus yourself? And do you have a different message, and can you present value? So look at the category, is it growing, and look at your competitors, and are you different? Can you make a compelling proposition? And then once you've been able to do that, determine which channel you're going to get in through. Are you going to sell into retail or food service or e-commerce, or all three, or two of those three? Understand the margins that come with going into each of those channels, and then select or target buyers accordingly. Do you want a distributor, or go direct to retail, or go through a consolidator, or go through? I mean, that's a whole other conversation. And if Kentrita wants to learn about the different market entry strategies, we're going to be sharing that in the UK market workshop So the UK Masterclass, sorry, not workshop, Masterclass, the UK Masterclass, which is being delivered next week. On the second day, we focus on the UK market, but on the first day, we focus on capability building. So I'd definitely recommend for Katerina to join that Masterclass if she wants to consider, what are all the sort of market selection criteria, setting a vision, mission, goals around export, and to understand the different market entry strategies, because those we will discuss at an overarching perspective. The UK element is when we're talking specifically about the UK market on the second day.
Thanks, Najib. Owen, perhaps this is one for you. Can you import hemp seed oil into Singapore?
From an organic point of view, which is my field of knowledge, absolutely. It's agricultural produce, so it would be regulated at our end under the Export Control Act and under there. And, well, is it food over there? So I'm going to have to say that I don't know about other relevant regulatory requirements, especially the product like hemp, whether it's considered a supplement or a food. That's outside my area of expertise. You could check out the Manual of Importing Country Requirements, the MyCore website over here, to see if there's anything in there related to hemp seed oil for Singapore. From an organic point of view, yes, but definitely check out all other potential regulatory requirements, like whoever the equivalent of the TGA or the FDA over there. Maybe it falls under their realm. Najib, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I haven't had a look at that product category, so I can't say for certain, but that's right. Yes, you'd have to look at the import department's website. It's usually pretty good, but there's a lot of information to sift through there. But it's something that I could probably. Who asked that question? Yeah, okay, Martin. I can send you the response to that. Wouldn't take us very long to figure that out at all.
Thanks, Najib. Any other questions from anyone at all? I think we've covered off all of the things that have come through, all the various spots. No, if not, we are able to wrap it up a little bit early today. So thank you firstly to Catherine from Asialink, Najib from Export Connect, and Owen, of course, from Australian Organic. Please go to the Trade Organic website and look at the series of masterclasses that we have coming up throughout the year, tailored for many different markets. Please reach out to us directly, any of us directly, if you have any questions on anything from today or anything, suggestions, comments, feedback for the future. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Sherry. Thanks, Najib.